All right, this is Mr. Johnson again, and we're going to do a small screencast, or I'm going to do a small screencast on Reconstruction. Reconstruction period lasted 1863, roughly 1865. It's kind of a gray area to 1877, which is another little gray area, but usually you got to put a definite start, definite ending time to different points in history. Now, if you know what the Reconstruction period is, it's the period after the Civil War. Reconstruction is pretty simple. People ask the question, what is it? Well, it's an era of time that the South, or not necessarily the South, the Union was rebuilding itself. And when you say the Union, we're referring to the United States. It is rebuilding itself and kind of, you know, licking its imposed wounds on itself through the Civil War. Now, the presidential reconstruction plans are simple. This man right here, which is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was one of the trailblazers for the plan of Reconstruction. If you remember back when we talked about the Civil War, he did not hate the South. He wanted to preserve the Union. And that is why the Civil War happened, because he wanted the nation to stay as one. Now, here was a plan. Anytime you have some kind of mass or large scale idea, you have to come up with a plan. So Lincoln's plan was fairly simple. The process, he wanted meeting a minimum test of loyalty. So in other words, you didn't have to be a fanatic about the Union, but just basically, if you believe in these things, then you need to be part of the Union. One was a proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction. That happened in 1863. In other words, it was kind of like a sign off saying, I will. This is basically a promise that I will do this, I will do this, I will adhere to these rules, guidelines, and legislation. Now, in turn for that, one thing that Abraham Lincoln would do, he would he would give full pardon to the Southerners who did a couple things. One, took an oath of allegiance to the Union and the Constitution, and two, accepted the emancipation of slaves. So he said, if you do these two things, then you can be part of the Union, and then go from there. You don't have to like it, just follow this plan. And then one other thing was state governments could be reestablished as soon as 10% of the population took the oath. So in other words, your statehood would be given to you if 10% of the population. So if you had 100 people in your population, if 10 people said, "Hey, we'll do these couple things," then you can. So in other words, he used what you call, what is necessarily called, is the 80-20 principle. If you get 80% of the people in, then you're successful in what you're trying to do. But he did less than that. He did the 90-10 rule, or 10-90 rule, actually. If you get 10% of the people to do this, then we're going to consider that successful. Now, you have a lot of political type jargon and jockeying for position going on. One thing, and this is a slide on all that if you're a big, political person. Um, you did have some parties that kind of developed out of this. Only non-Confederates could vote on new state constitutions. In other words, only people that were a part of the Union could vote on certain things. So that really pushed everybody because you're either outside or you're in and you're making a difference. So if you decided to not have anything to do with the government, you could get steamrolled by a bunch of legislation and laws that you did not like if you were part of the Confederacy or continued to be part of the Confederacy. And then one big establishment was the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau was one of the basic foundations for not just blacks but also white. But it was called the Freedmen's Bureau because it was basically, um, Congress was ready to reassert its power after the war in 1865. So after the Civil War, Congress wanted to show that they still had some clout. and the Freedmen's Bureau was founded. Now it was for refugees, freedmen, and also on abandoned land. Because you remember, in abandoned land in the South, a lot of these fields and plantations were abandoned because there were no slaves to work them. So a lot of whites at this point, at Southern whites, they went from living, what they say, high off the hog, or living being very rich, and then all of a sudden going straight to the poorhouse, literally. Now the Freedmen's Bureau was there to alleviate some of this, and some things that the Freedmen's Bureau done. It provided food, shelter, and medical aid to the destitute, and it benefited blacks, mostly free blacks, and the homeless whites. Most of these whites were people in the South that plantations had crumbled and they had no way of making money. And also, they had the authority to resettle freed blacks on confiscated farmland. So the government, when you leave these plantations, large plantations, just kind of laying around, the government would take that land, clean it off, and it was for the blacks. A lot of the blacks also did a lot of sharecropping in this point, and a lot of poor whites did as well. So a lot of people think the Freedmen's Bureau was just strictly for the black. It was not. It was for the poor and destitute as well. So it's kind of like a government aid for those people who couldn't do for themselves. Freedmen's Bureau. It was led by a guy named Oliver O. Howard. I want to say that name real slow so you can take that in. Um, the greatest success was in education. There was 3,000 schools for freed blacks, as well as several colleges in that. Some colleges were like St. Augustine in the Raleigh area. You have a lot of these Slater Industrial, which is now Winston-Salem State University. You had a lot of these that come out around that time, not specifically from there, but those were spawned from that area or that era of time. Um, the Freedmen's Bureau could also, they kept, I guess, a running tally. From 200 to 300,000 African Americans learned how to read. And the funding from the government ended in 1870. Now, this now is something that the Reconstruction era didn't end in 1870. It ended about 7 years later. So there was some other things that was done in that era of time as well, as far as Reconstruction. Now, here's the thing. At this point during the Reconstruction, there was Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. So there was a guy from Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, who had the same things in mind. Basically, he carried out the rest of this plan, but he did some alterations to it. But some things that were different from Abraham Lincoln was this. He was from Tennessee. He was Tennessee's war governor, actually. And the problem with him was he was a white supremacist, which wasn't atypical at the time. Abraham Lincoln, in the Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln basically said that, you know, the blacks, the African Americans here were to be equal under laws and have the same rights. But he said in the Douglas debates that it was never his intention to have the blacks and the whites live socially equal. He said that, and at this point, he could see that never happening. And also, he's seen that these individuals, that in every place in the land, if there were two or more races, there always had to be a dominant race, and he thought that his was his own. So, you know, Andrew Johnson's plan and Abraham Lincoln's views were similar to that aspect. It was not to make blacks equal. It was just to bring them from slavery to make them supportive, uh, productive citizens. All right. Now, Andrew Johnson's plan was similar to Lincoln's plan. Um, it, if you look at these things that I have here, and also, but if you look at these two main things, all former leaders and office holders of the Confederacy, excuse me, Confederates was more than 20,000 in taxable property, and that's pretty much some of the disenfranchisement of certain groups. So, in other words, these groups did not like what was going on. He frequently pardoned the wealthy planters, many former Confederates, by the fall of 1865. Okay, so that was just an overview of the Reconstruction. Um, there's things like black codes and all this kind of stuff that we'll talk about later on. But right now, that's just a gist of everything. So it's Mr. Johnson signing off.